Hello, I'm Moni Vargas, the Creative and Program Director at Breakthrough, a nonprofit culture change organization that uses media, arts, and tech to promote human rights. Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight, our weekly video and podcast series featuring conversations with community leaders, activists, artists, and partner organizations working to build a world that is more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable for all. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to Breakthrough Spotlight. My name is Charlie Amáyá Scott. My English pronouns are they, her, and I will be today's moderator for this lovely panel. Emily and Taté, could you introduce yourselves, please?
Thank you, yeah. Wapilo tanka mitaki api. Chante washte iu hanape chiojapi kishto. Jisha tatewi machiapi. Wakpa washte mantan. Hello, my friends and relatives. I greet you all with a good heart. My name is Taté, which is Lakota for wind, because I am full of it. Hey, I'm just kidding. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. That's in South Dakota. My pronouns are they, them, and mother. I am Mniconjou Lakota and a two-spirit storyteller, Indigenous rights activist. I do a lot of work around inclusive community building using storytelling as a foundation. That's led me through fields of news and editorial writing, social work, education. I'm blessed to work for a local tribal school district here on O'odham Peeposh lands in so-called Phoenix area as their communications director. So every day I get to work with Indigenous youth and families to help reshape and reimagine from within a system that has historically and presently even committed severe and lasting traumas for Natives and, of course, other marginalized peoples. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Hey everybody, I'm Emily Johnson, and I am from the Yupik Nation. I grew up on Dena'ina and Kanaitsi land, and I live now on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in Lenape-Hoking. And I am a choreographer and a maker of time and space with people. I really love the word gathering, and I think about how performance and the making of it in community and with communities of people is a part of the entire offering of the performance. So everything from the making of it to the doing it, and I really equate performance and dance and making and story with action in the world that has a good force and a good intention. And my pronouns are she, hers. And just in this time that we are in, I sometimes get a bit emotional, and so that might happen tonight. I think I just tend to get a little bit emotional anyway, but it's heightened, of course, now. But just, I don't know, I guess I just offer that if that happens, like, it's okay and it's good, but yeah, that just might occur.
Tears are healing. So my first question is, and actually goes to what you were talking about, that mention of healing and also tears, but also this practice of making with a focus on good intentions. So over the last few years, community care has become quite popular with mainstream U.S. society. And I'm wondering, Emily, if you could share with us about what community care means for you.
I think about listening. I think about listening to the complexities that exist in every community, and listening not only to the humans in that community, but all of the beings that comprise and are part of that community from the past into the future. And that opening spaces for listening, I think that's the good start of every making, right? Even if making a sentence, it's like listening to the question first, or listening to the thing spoken just before, the thing whispered just before, that thing that you heard on the wind, and then finding way that in the making or in the response, that the care, like that is care, you know. And I work a lot with my friend Karen Recollet, and she talks about my work as processions of care, which I need to think a little bit more about, and maybe start to write a little bit about what that means. But I think that means the way in which making, and whether that's dance or story or gathering people to plant trees or gathering people to march, not that I've been gathering those people, but those processions of care, like that is of like our utmost duty, right? To be in care processions with one another. And in those processions of care, which don't always have to be moving, sometimes they're still and sometimes they're in one place for a long time, but in that deep process of listening, there can arrive transformational processes that come from within the community, you know. So the community is beginning to really clarify what care means to themselves, you know, and that like self-determined like care, you know, but it comes from that transformational process, I think.
Thank you, Emily. Along the same lines, Taté, so in an earlier conversation we had, you had mentioned about gathering medicine, and so there's like good intentions there, because when you gather medicine, you have to have good intentions and good thoughts with this practice. And I'm wondering, how has that practice informed or defined what community care is for you?
In the same vein as what Emily was just saying, you know, how do we take caregiving and transform that into something that's like daily practice, but in a way that's like meaningful and not just like I babysat my kid, right? Like they were on the computer and they lived through the day, which that's good for a lot of people. Like I was definitely a new mom myself, and there were days where I was like, she lived, and that's not to knock anyone's, but I also really think that we've sort of lost the art of caregiving, especially when it comes to like community caregiving, especially with the Native communities, because that's the community I belong to and talk about all the time. But you know, for Lakota people, we have this concept of mitakyo yasin, and a lot of folks in Indigenous communities have something similar that translates to we're all related or we're all relatives, and that really translates to every being on this planet. I mean, it's not a fanciful new age thing. This has been eons in the making and understanding since time immemorial, since our origin stories were first told. It was all about caretaking and caregiving to everything. And understanding that is a lifelong process for sure, that I think it's easy to get lost in because it's huge to think about, right? Like the rock under my foot is a relative, right? Like the bird that just crapped on my car is a relative. Like, how do we make space for that in a way that's meaningful right now? So gathering medicines is a way I think that I can do that practice, because it forces me to think of things that would normally just be underfoot as relatives. And I have to think of it as relatives in the same way I would think of my kid as a relative, or you as a relative. You know, there's a lot of conversations within, say, vegan communities about how people who eat meat are terrible folks. You know, it's this eco-fascism aspect of like, only plants matter and you can't eat meat, and if you do eat meat, then you're a terrible, vicious, violent person who should die. And these are literally things that are told like to people all the time, especially Indigenous people, right? Subsistence tribes, for instance, Pacific Northwest Coast or Alaska Native tribes, Canadian tribes that would subsist upon, say, seal hunting, are often villainized in these conversations by people who could care less about the folks picking the vegetables, you know, or the folks in the fields who don't have masks for COVID-19 protection, you know, like, so there's like a bunch of layers to this that caregiving, I think, could really blend well for folks if we really took to heart what caregiving is and means. So medicine gathering, something that, you know, isn't as, you know, we think of medicine a lot of times in ways that like Western and colonized folks do, like, oh, you have to have a PhD to know what medicine is, right? And PhDs are awesome. I don't have one, but I totally think they're great. So if you're getting one or have one, you're awesome. But I think also that just mainstream folks tend to think of medicine as something that's above our heads. Like, we don't understand it. We're prescribed it when we are told to take it, and that's it. But it's not that way, right? Like, there are some pretty awesome thinkers out there. Dr. Robin Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, just a phenomenal book of love about all growing things, including humans. Wherever you live is a relative nearby, and they all have something to tell us. They've always been here for us. We've just really forgotten how to talk to them. Living here in the Phoenix Valley, you know, people tend to think of the desert as dead, right? And, you know, oh, you live in the oven, right? And it's like, yeah, it's really hot here, but holy poop, things grow year round, like just on their own without water. And it's pretty awesome to look at the growth and life all around. And so when you learn or take the time to learn from the folks that are indigenous to these places. So for me, you know, like I said, I'm blessed to work with O'odham and Peeposh folks in Salt River, because they teach really, again, just practical and daily things about, like, yeah, do you know saguaro fruit is in season now and people can use it and make really awesome food, but also medicine and stuff that helps your skin. And, oh, you're having tummy troubles, you know, like, did you eat cheese? Well, you know, eat some, the fruit that, you know, it's just laying around pretty much. I mean, it's literally falling off cactus right now. And it's pretty awesome to first have that knowledge. Like, once you have it and you're able to be like, oh, you know, that's, you know, greasewood, and it's awesome for cleansing the air, and really good for prayer. If you don't have, like, for me, coming by northern sage is not something I can do right now. It's not something that grows here, but man, you know, greasewood does, and that's, you know, smells fantastic. And if my intention is to ceremony where I'm at, and ceremony through caregiving with whatever that is, and for me, medicine gathering is a big part of that. Why is that any less, right? If I were doing it with sage in my own territory, in my own lands, as here in Phoenix Valley, right? Like, I have to be able to bring that ceremony and that caregiving and that medicine with me wherever I'm at. Otherwise, what am I doing as an Indigenous person, as a mother, right? Or as somebody who says they care? So that's my, like, sort of daily goal, just to sort of really try to, first of all, try to see things as relatives, because that forces me to think of it in caregiving ways.
As you both know, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting our community and also the Black communities as well, both locally and globally. What has been your experience with this pandemic? What are some of your concerns, and what are some of your hopes, especially keeping in mind these acts of caregiving, being a possession of care, and also continue the giving care, Taté?
The New York Times had an article. It was titled, "The Fullest Look Yet at the Racial Inequality of Coronavirus." You might think, wow, this article probably has a lot of cool information about the ways COVID-19 impacts marginalized communities, especially people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. But there was not one reference, statistic, or data point about how this disease is impacting Natives, which, if you're Native, you know it's impacting us at disproportionately high rates. I mean, to the point of being like the hotspot of the hotspots, Navajo Nation, Dene folks, Apache folks, the White Mountain Apache here in Arizona. I mean, Arizona, living here, it's really tough because we have these high numbers impacting our communities, and yet you go outside and there's still people like, it's my free speech right not to wear a mask. I'm like, well, that's nothing. That doesn't mean what you think it means. And it's really, really disheartening and frustrating to just see the just disingenuous way that people are being people. Humans being is just not a fantastic thing right now. So, you know, it's that's tough, especially because I mean, the data's out there. If you were to go to any Native or Indigenous news platform. I'm thinking Indian Country Today. I'm thinking pretty much any Canadian outlet like CBC that would have this data daily updated. I mean, shoot, even go to the Navajo Nation's website. It's like the first thing they talk about, like, wow, this thing's huge. We have data. We've been tracking it. We have scientists. Who would have thought? That's enraging to know that we just rate so low as to not even exist in the realm of mainstream media and mainstream just knowledge of what this virus is doing. And it's not hard to get that information, but it just furthers that erasure that we feel on so many levels. And especially with something as devastating as this has been to our communities. I mean, that erasure has a deadly impact. And we see that every day.
So many things come to my mind. It was a community meeting, and for an hour, we were very pointedly kind of making points about what was. We were talking about the performing arts. We were talking about what was inequitable in the performing arts field, and then the second half of that conversation was about what we vision for future. And, I was speaking of justice and reparations, specifically for Black and Indigenous and other artists of color. And so just to say, there's this long meeting with very specific points. And at the end, the question was like, back to the group was, what does equity look like? And I actually got a little upset internally, because in my mind of like, equity is when we don't have to focus on equity anymore because we have it, and the erasure that has been and does continually to very actually kill Indigenous people, is something that is so highlighted because of COVID. And I mean, it makes me shake to sit with it. But here we've been sitting with it, for months, and being in New York City, which was an epicenter and was early, and like being able to like sit here and see what was going to come to our rural areas, to reservations, and to the rest of what is called the United States was horrifying for me as a person, like learning in real time at a moment that was prior, and the thing, I think the things that I hope for, and I am like a distressingly hopeful person, right? Like I will be in this moment and like see hope and like see how we can like get to another place that is more hopeful, and how even then it's like this, and like you were talking, Taté, like we are all related, and also everything is related. And some of the things that I've been part of during this COVID crisis, I mean, I've been called to deliver food to elderly residents in my neighborhood, most of whom live in NYCHA housing, which is the low-income housing of New York City. And, those first couple weeks of doing it, it was like people would open their door like such a tiny crack, but even that was like such this beautiful intimate space of like staying far away, and I'm masked, and but like because there was such fear for what was on the other side of that door, even though they knew that food was coming, right? But it was just like to protect against this virus. And now weeks later, people are feel more comfortable in opening the doors, and so that the exchange is still brief and it's still very safe, but it's interesting to be watching the intimacy space change, I guess. And something about that makes me hopeful, like seeing that intimacy space able to grow again here a little bit in a place that I mean, the massive amount of grief that is here, that will be in other places, that is in other places now, we have to contend with. And also thinking how Adrienne Marie Brown calls it emergent. Like my friend Karen Recollet and I, we've been writing through the whole COVID process and just really thinking about this as also an emergent time. And so what is necessary about emergent, about being about an emergent time, not a time necessarily when somebody says we can like come back like into out into the streets or out with our community, but like how are we in an emergent time always within ourselves and our communities, and maybe through the ways that we care. I've been looking at this one tree out my window for months as I sit here and like building this really real relationship with this tree, because for so many days that was the only being that I could see. And there's something in that is hopeful too, and finding ways to really be in a collaborative, I think, relationship with that tree, with other trees. And I can't help but also now we're in the Black Lives Matter uprising, and the way in which the focus on reparations has like, it's become entwined in this heavy moment of COVID. And so my body's been called to go deliver food, and my body's been called to those marches and called to be out on the streets, and trying to put myself in that place of listening to the Black leaders who are leading those marches, who are leading this movement, who are calling for their reparations, their liberation, and finding the ways in which my Indigenous body can be part of that absolutely necessary and very hopeful action. And the ways in which I've seen, our Indigenous communities really, really rise to be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter is really incredible. And knowing that there are so many specifics, and it's not to merge, but like at all. Even in thought, there are so many specifics, but that Black liberation is so intrinsically and absolutely tied to Indigenous sovereignty. And our Indigenous communities need to deal with the anti-Blackness that exists. Black communities and individuals and people need to deal with the erasure, the continuous or continued erasure of Indigenous people that we were just speaking of. But seeing how that healing work is in fits and starting and part of this larger moment, that is really hopeful. The concerns I have are about the fucked up systems that, sorry, I don't know if I can say that that have been in rule for so long that like fight their crumbling to the teeth, and my concerns are that we stay so that we stay focused, taking down these imperialist and nationalist and horrific statues is so good, but that can't be the only thing, like all of the museums that those statues are in front of need to return all of our belongings, like they're like, I hope that we don't get swayed into, well, that's good enough, like how do we extend our what is it? It's like deep want and also right and also like self-determined like agency for sovereignty and liberation. And I think care. I think that's cares such entwined in those two spaces in different ways, but very beautifully.
Wow, that is a lot, Emily. So thank you so much. Because you brought up, going back earlier into your comment, you were bringing up justice and reparations, and tying it back to Tate's discussion around erasure. I think there's this we're literally in a moment of movements for justice, locally, nationally, and globally. And my question for both of you is, what are we learning, and what can we learn from these movements that we cannot if we were just still? Because I think there was like a moment for many of us when there was like a moment of stillness, but that's partly because I think media attention wasn't on it. But I personally cannot remember a time when we were like, where things were this moving, for lack of better words.
The movements that we're seeing feel different for sure. And perhaps it's because we're all sort of forced to watch it. There's nothing else happening. That we get sort of front row seats, when we're not as bombarded with those arbitrary things like sports and, what would have been like massive campaigning. And that's still happening. But I think we're really sort of forced to see ourselves in these movements somehow, whether that's in a positive way or a bad way, depending on who you are. So that's something to think about. Don't have good words for that, but I think I know a lot of Indigenous folks, non-Black people in general, get it in their head that they can't be participants within the Black Lives Matter movement, as if like they're somehow separate and apart from it, and that's absolutely not true. I think you just have to look at the issues that are important to you, whether it's family or caregiving or destroying those monuments, that Emily was talking about, and you start to see yourself in Black Lives Matter in particular. Black Lives Matter is such a pivotal aspect and drive to the change that we're sort of we've wanted and now get to see in little increments, starting with those monument falling. We saw a little bit of that with some of the white supremacy protests in the South a couple of years ago, as Confederate monuments were sort of coming down and it just sort of stalled, and seeing it happen now. I think the example of solidarity is well within the perspective of Indigenous issues. 3 pipeline projects have come to a halt. Keystone XL Pipeline, Atlantic Coast, Dakota Access Pipeline, all with Indigenous resistance at the center, but all of that had solidarity from Black Lives Matter folks as well. Having been a participant at Standing Rock in 2016, Black Lives Matter was a huge aspect of that. And in case anyone's not aware, we have Black folks in our communities. There are Black Indigenous folks. My family is full of those beautiful folks. And so to say that we don't benefit in the ways we think Black people will with Black Lives Matter is a fallacy, and one that really just goes to hurt our communities than strengthen them. The monuments, that Emily was mentioning, it might not be, it's not enough for sure, but it's a hell of a starting point. Seeing Columbus statues go down, and being someone who has advocated for murdered and missing Indigenous women for quite a long time, too long, and have gone to legislative hearings to fight for funding. Seeing Columbus removed from quite a few areas has been pretty amazing. His legacy is all too contemporary. He might just be a stone and a paragraph in a history book, but my kid's 11, and Columbus wrote in his journals, about girls my kid's age and younger who were sold as sex slaves. So, we have to be able to partner, right, and show that we are all related. That Mniconjou Yasin is within movements too. There's been a lot of hard work happening to get things like Columbus statues down, And I never want to say, that's it's not enough, because it's more than we've had. And I'm really jazzed to see. God, I'm such an ugly crier, but really jazzed to see how Black Lives Matter is pushing this idea that justice can be a myriad of things. It's not just stop killing Black people, which it definitely starts there, but it's, abolish police, put that fund in another place that can use it. Get rid of statues that glorify the killing of Black people, because those people also glorified killing Indigenous folks. I hope it's not news to people watching, but our survival and our thrivance is so interconnected. What benefits Black Lives Matter invariably and inherently and so lovingly benefits our communities as Indigenous folks. And if we don't see that, we're just that's the colonizer lens coming over our eyes, not to see that. So, the pipelines, the Columbus, and something near and dear to my heart is the mascot removal. I was politicized in high school. I talk about this in some of my writings a lot, but I sort of staked my claim as an activist, fighting against Indian mascots, the dehumanizing images and names that professional teams, but also non-professional teams, high schools across the nation utilize as a way to objectify us, and which goes into that erasure, right? The whole, we're all connected, the interconnection of all these issues we're talking about starts with these small surface level things like statues and mascots. And we're seeing huge movement in those areas thanks to Black Lives Matter. The Washington football team is losing money because of that name now. It used to be the opposite. They used to get too much money, so why care what 1 or 3 or 5,000 or 5 million natives say about that name, as long as they made the money. But Target's backed out. Other big box stores have backed out. That's a lot. That's saying something. We have a long way to go, but when you ask where I find some joy in this time, it's that the work that we've put in, the literal blood and sweat, and obviously tears, is coming into a spotlight that everyone can see, and everyone is talking about, and almost forced to talk about, and they never have before. What a time to be Indigenous, and to participate in these ways of being a good relative.
Thank you, Taté.
I so appreciate everything that you've just shared, and that every step is meaningful and related to steps that those before us took so that we could take these ones. I guess I was thinking earlier today about how in the colonial framework we're meant to understand scarcity, and that that resisting that is to know abundance. And how abundant each one of these steps is. And I apologize for making any little of taking a statue down. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to equate that at all, because I recognize that labor, the hundreds of years of labor, and the very present physical labor, And there's something so beautiful about again the healing tears and an abundance there too of flowing. I don't know. Thank you.
You know, I work within a school system, a tribal school system, and another way that we benefit from these discussions of Black lives and the discussions of how we can make sure people know Black Lives Matter, right? The ways we as Indigenous communities benefit really comes through within like the curriculum that we're trying to build out within this tribal school system. You know, the ways that our Native kids not just see themselves, but see other people in general, right? How many, middle school and high school curriculum include Black authors, Indigenous authors, books and ways of knowing and thinking by Indigenous and Black scholars? None, really. And we're almost forced now. And if we're not forced, it's a really great conversation starter to say, hey, how come we don't have a Black author in this 5th grade curriculum? How come we don't have Indigenous authors, as scientists in our science curriculum? You know, we have lots of folks, right? How come our arts, don't include, playwrights and people within movements, right? How come we don't have those ways of thinking in our own tribal community schools? And what's awesome to see and be part of these conversations, and perhaps Emily, you've seen this too in some of the work you've been doing with these different boards full of different people and different perspectives, is they can't say no right now. They really couldn't ever, but it might have been easier for them in the past to be like, well, money, right? But now they face the judgment of the masses if they refuse these kinds of inclusive world building for our youngest people. And that's not a good thing. And they know it. And I really love being part of the building go, like for instance, there was one of our colleagues in the curriculum team was talking about literacy and how they could sort of promote their initiatives. And there was words like, discover and manifest and, kind of trigger words for a lot of Native people. And it was really cool to be like, hey, I see what you're saying, but did you know that there's some real historical traumas associated with words like these? How can we, as literacy people who know lots of words, think of other words that might more better reflect what we're trying to teach our kids? And man, it was awesome to be like, for them to have light bulbs. You just see them going off like, oh, you're right? And they were, I'm not racist. It's like, that's not what I said. But maybe, it was really fun to sort of see, right? Again, the benefits, the residual benefits, if you want to talk about trickle down benefits, this Black Lives Matter moment and movement, not just now, but of course, years and a decade almost in the making now, obviously in generations and hundreds of years, right, in the making, we're seeing that we do benefit and we have just as much at stake and should therefore be just as much on those lines with our Black and brown brothers and sisters as they fight these injustices.
Honestly, yes. All of that is important. Mic drop for you, Taté. In the conversation we've been having, there's been this underlying theme of emergence and futurity. And both of you are storytellers in your own ways, whether it's a writer, whether it's a choreographer, whether both of you are both activists. And my question is how do those themes of emergence and futurity, how does it inform your work, but also how does it inform your hopes and strives for liberation for both Black and brown Indigenous peoples and other people of color who have been affected by U.S. imperialism?
I've been, for many years, with communities of folks in the process of building a performance, doing different versions of community visioning, right? Community visioning processes. And there's one process that we developed with the Native American Community Development Institute in Minneapolis. This is back at maybe 2014 or 15 or something. And so through this process of really focusing on what you concentrically, what do you want for your well-being, what do you want for the well-being of your chosen friends and family, or your community, how you define it, and your world, like looking at these concentric circles of communities that each individual can in different ways relate to. And of course, each of those communities relates back and then also relates to the larger communities in the world. And, you know, processes of visioning for the last many years that are always so generative, and and I think that being in a process of defining vision with a vast groups of people, not only in what's called the United States, but also in what is called Australia and in Canada. Like, it brought me to, like, okay, we can envision a better world. We can envision sovereignty. We can envision liberation. We know, like, we feel it in our blood and our bones. Like, that's how strongly that vision is. And lately, like in the last year or so, I've been trying to tune in my artistic processes. All right, how do rather than visioning it, and then in that case it remains out here, like how do we be inside of it? How do we be in that future now? Like, what is that emergence? What does that emergence look like? How do we be in it so strongly that it becomes what is? And like, I don't know what that technology is yet, but like that is really juicy for me right now. You know, and I guess I think about that in my ways in my personal being also. You know, like, okay, I want to be a mom. I want to be a mom so much. And then, like, well, if I am a mother, maybe that brings it into being, you know? Like, if it's not only a play of words, or it's not only I think there's a technology in figuring out the being in that future, being in that that in a way shifts space and time. So you call that vision to here, you know? And I think it's what our ancestors visioned for us. And so in a way we're like calling like this, you know? And so it's so powerful right now. And I think that, yeah, as you said, Taté, what an amazing time to be right now. Yeah.
So there's a conversation that's happened in Indian country probably since, you know, colonizers came through, and it's sort of surrounds this idea of, am I enough? Am I doing it right? And the it being like indigeneity, like being native enough, being whatever that means, right? You know, just because we've talked about it already, you know, ensuring that medicinal knowledge gets passed down, you know, for me makes, you know, it means learning to do it every day, or having everyday practices, and being able to teach it in ways that our young people in particular can take with them, you know, accessibly, right? Like, do the best you have with what you have. Do the best you can with what you have, and you know, the rest will come later. The convo about, you know, are you enough? You know, who's more native than someone else? Who can we push out? You know, that only pits natives against other natives. It's a very colonial way to think about ourselves as relatives, right? Of not just each other, but of everything around us. And it hurts, in particular, our future, of course. Hurts us now. We see these conversations happen all the time. To some of our most vulnerable community members, in particular, youth. When I've worked in social work, I had Native youth that I would have in my intake program and be talking with them about their tribes, and they would say, no, I'm not Native. And I'd be like, well, it says here your mother's, Dakota. That means you are therefore Dakota. No, I never grew up on the res. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah, it does. My grandma said I'm not Indian enough. I don't know the language. I don't know the ways. I've never been to ceremony. And they had like this laundry list of ways that they didn't belong. And it was like, who the heck are these people telling this kid, right? I mean, I'm working at the time and was doing juvenile justice reform work and trying to keep kids in South Dakota, especially Native kids, out of the prison system, because that's one of the many ways that we see socioeconomic disadvantages within our Native youth in particular is incarceration. And I would say, well, if you want to know why we're failing them because we're not including them in anything. And one of the things my program was known for, and it continued on even after I was done because it was so successful, is just those starting points, right? Knowing, of course, it wasn't enough, that there was always more to do, but it was a starting point to just really, like, you've heard of gateway drugs, well, there's gateway culture too, right? There's ways to really connect kids with that identity piece that's missing. Just a gaping hole for their spirits, and it leads to these really terrible outcomes. And we see this now, right? We're having conversations about Native youth who are just Native people who look too Black, right? Or they speak Spanish instead of Lakota, or they've never been to the reservation, or they've never done ceremony. They've been rejected, and that piece of their identity is rejected. And so, we see these outcomes. Health outcome is a big piece of that, right? That erasure that we talked about, that's self-erasure, within our own communities. Like, how dare we? So when you talk about future and these things that we do to ensure our future is there at all, we have to look to our youth, our young people, to really make sure that stays put. I think if we're all working toward being the good ancestor someone prays to later in life, then we have to incorporate our young people. We have to teach them and let them participate, again, in accessible ways. Right now, that means, and I think COVID-19 has really sort of been a driving force for a lot of Native communities to realize, the way that we're doing things, this idea that you're not enough, right? Like, oh, you didn't go to powwow, you don't know how to powwow dance, whatever, right? Like, well, we're not doing it right. So then you have like social distance powwow that comes on, and all of a sudden everyone can sort of get in the regalia and dance, and there's contests, and it's like, wow, that's pretty beautiful. I kind of really dig that we've been able to take something that I think a lot of folks use as a defense mechanism, right? The gatekeeping to Indigenous communities, powwowing, right? Sort of that first step of indigeneity. And we've blasted that wide open. Anyone can sort of participate right now online. In the same way, a lot of the stuff we're doing within the education system is kind of the same. You have a lot of purists who are like, the only way you can learn language is with an elder. And I think if you can do that, I think if you have access to that, that's a fantastic way to learn your language. And I am so jealous of people who have that. I don't. I have, like many natives in my generation and earlier, I should say, boarding school really wiped out a lot of our language keepers. And so, language is culture. And without language, the culture really starts to die. And I think, the book I mentioned before, Robin Kimmerer, talks a lot about how the language of our relatives that aren't human gets lost when we lose our language of indigeneity. And so refinding and reconnecting with those is super important. And COVID-19 has really shown us we elders definitely still have a role to play, but they can play it in ways that are accessible to our young people. Zoom, we've had so many Zoom language classes that are kind of amazing to watch, because my kid can come in and learn something, right? She knows more Dene words right now than she does Lakota, and that's on me, but Dene is a beautiful language, so we'll let it go. No, but it's fun to really see young people sort of driving what they want, what they need, right, out of their Indigenous ways of knowing, what they need out of their elders. And right now we need places in the digital realities that we're finding ourselves in to connect. And so, we've seen medicinal walks on Zoom, people doing live streams of how they're, harvesting their saguaro fruit. I've Linda Black Elk, her social media handles are just full of fantastic Indigenous medicinal knowledge. And I mean, she goes outside, she was like, look at this dandelion. And then it's an hour-long conversation about what the dandelion everything does. And so it's like, it's totally accessible. It's things that our youth can really grasp onto and participate in their culture. And that's Indigenous future right there. There are so many other ways, but I think if we could start there, just meeting our kids where they're at right now, that's a really great way to make sure that, Tashunka Wiko, Crazy Horse's vision of the 7 generations and doing now, so that 7 generations later, we see success in that thrivance, right? Not just survival, right? Who wants to just survive all the time? It's a really terrible state to be in all the time. I'm really jazzed that we have resilience, but man, I would love to not be like congratulated for being so resilient all the time. Wow, you've really struggled. Thanks. I want to thrive, and I want my kid to thrive, and I want like her kids to thrive, and we can, right? Like we're seeing those little pockets of awesome come forth, and like seeing Charlie and the success that they have with academics, the fire tweets they have. Like I'm always just like, yes, that's some magic happening, and magic doesn't have to be fantastically unbelievable. It can be just like what we're producing right now. I mean, we used to call magic just being, man, and that's that Matakio Yasin just coming back, right? We're all related. It's all related. Just everything we've been talking about just really connects. And it's if we can get our youth in there, I think that's where we'll really see the future come to a point of come to a point of that thrivance that I keep talking about. I guess that with they're leading the way, we step back and let them lead and see what's needed for them to thrive. I think I can live with that.
Thank you, Taté. So I have one last question. And with all that's happening in this tumultuous time, and both of you just being present, but also looking towards the future, how have you been able to cultivate joy and healing for yourselves, for your community, for all the spaces that you enter, are involved with?
One tree that I visit here in Lenape-Hoking, not every day, but very, very regularly, and almost every day. And visiting with this tree, listening to the river that's there, trying to listen to just before COVID started, my a story of my great grandmother came into like a written form, and I'm listening to her story of thrivance and how she emerged all of us through her thrivance and survival, and finding joy in that, trying to, because I have been actually quite grief-stricken here, and death has been very present. Trying to find joy in the tiniest things. I've been growing these tobacco plants and listening to them, and texting my friend Karen, who I told you about, just the tiniest things, whether that was today I managed to boil this cedar tea from the cedar that you sent me, you know, like just the thing that like is the joy in that moment, and trying in a way to coming back to the trees, like trying in a way to think of like, not only what are we feeling and experiencing now, both the grief and the joy, but the other beings that we've also been bringing into this conversation and being with in this conversation, like where are their feelings right now, and really like really making sure I'm not placing the importance of my or of a human feeling above, and yet also really cherishing the joy that I'm seeing come out of these moments, those little that joy of like the door opening a little further and delivering the food, you know, the joy that I'm seeing in the streets that comes from so many centuries of grief. Finding that joy, it's incredible.
You know, to be humble within the framework that you find yourself in is so important, right? Like, as humans, we tend to see ourselves as like the center of everything, and yet trees stand as this sort of timeless reminder that we're really small in the vast scheme of the cosmos. And it's kind of beautiful to really just see yourself as like, yeah, you know, like maybe I've done some bad stuff, but like in the grand scheme of things, like the world's gonna probably be okay. And like the life that comes from it will find a way, because it usually does. Like we're not the center of the universe in that way. So yeah, collecting those medicines, you know, however that might look, the creosote, the greasewood, you know, the fruit that just comes naturally in the desert, getting scent medicines. Navajo tea is being harvested right now, so I'm getting bundles of that. It's pretty awesome. You know, the cedar there and the sage that come from my family up in South Dakota, like it just sort of remind me that the joy can come from anything, and joy is in and of itself its own kind of ceremony. And to like really try to connect with that, and again, the small ways, right? Like, you know, protesting is ceremony, right? Like if you've ever been to a sweat lodge and then sort of compared that to protesting in 110-degree heat, there's some like similarities there. Like it's really hot and you're sacrificing something, right? And for good, right? And to get through it, you pray a little bit, and it's just kind of a cool thing to be like passing on to the next gen. But in a very like sort of, because I'm a geek at heart, one of the best ways I find joy, and have always found joy throughout my whole life, is with books. Escaping through narratives that aren't my own. And I have to give a shout out to my homegirl, Rebecca Rowanhorse, Black Indigenous author of some amazing sci-fi and fantasy narratives out there. And can recommend Trail of Lightning, that series. I've read both the books. I also recommend listening to the audiobooks. I'm a big audiobook fan because I can do several things at once. And hearing, you know, Danae spoken is a little bit better when someone who knows what they're talking about says it, because when I'm reading it, I'm like, ooh, I'm just going to skip through that. I don't know those long vowel words. But so yeah, reading and participating in sort of escaping in another person's imagination really helps me sort of see that I can have some joy too, even if that's just a little bit of entertainment at a time. So.
Well, thank you so much, Taté, and thank you so much, Emily, for this conversation.